Welcome to the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices and Youth online seminar series. The center conducts research and provides trainings and technical assistance which investigate problems, craft solutions, and design actionable strategies for translating research into usable, feasible, and effective strategies for transitioning stakeholders, which include VR agencies, policymakers, researchers, transitioning youth and their family, educators, practitioners, and employers. Our online seminars are designed to provide VR counselors and other youth employment stakeholders with short training lessons on a wide variety of topics related to VR practices and youth outcomes. Each seminar is conducted by well-respected content experts. Once you've watched the online seminar, you have the opportunity to take a quiz to show what you've learned. A link to the quiz will appear once the seminar video is completed. If you score 70% or higher on the quiz, you'll be emailed a certificate of completion for your records. If your score is below 70%, you'll have one additional chance to re-watch the seminar and take the quiz. Check out our website at www.vrpracticesandyouth.org and check it out frequently for new seminars, publications, free webinars on topics related to providing effective vocational rehabilitation services to youth and young adults, or to contact us directly with questions. The Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices and Youth is funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration on Community Living. Now, on to the seminar.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to an introduction to inclusive higher education and its impact on vocational rehabilitation services for people with intellectual disability. Next slide. Today's objectives are to describe the origin of inclusive higher education in the United States and the impact of legislative guidance from the Higher Education Opportunities Act of 2008. We'll also present an overview of the federally funded model demonstration projects called TPSIDs and the current provision of services in higher education. We'll also describe the impact of higher education on employment outcomes for people with intellectual disability. And finally, we'll describe partnerships between higher education and vocational rehabilitation in supporting students with intellectual disability. Next slide. A little bit of background on me. My name's Meg Grigal. I am the co-director of Think College. I'm also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In these roles, I serve as the principal investigator for a number of federally funded projects, the TPSID National Coordinating Center, the Stepping Up in Technology Future Quest Island project, and the I3 funded Think College Transition project. In addition to these projects, I also have the great joy of working with the RRTC on VR and transitioning youth. And it's in that project's capacity that I'm sharing this information with you today. Next slide. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background about Think College. Next slide. Think College is a national organization dedicated to developing, expanding, and improving research and practice in inclusive higher education for people with intellectual disability. We have a website at www.thinkcollege.net where there's a variety of resources, including a public directory of available post-secondary education options for students with intellectual disability, as well as a resource and a policy library. We'd love for you to come and visit our website and use our resources as you move forward in working with students with intellectual disability who are accessing college to help them improve their employment outcomes. Next slide. So what is inclusive higher education? Next slide. Inclusive higher education is a developing field of research and practice It's aimed at creating a viable and legitimate alternative pathway to and through higher education for students with intellectual disability that culminates in either integrated and competitive paid employment or the pursuit of further higher education. Next slide. Now, inclusive higher education contains the word inclusive, but not all higher education opportunities for people with intellectual disability are inclusive. So next I'm going to share a little bit about the kinds of higher education experiences that students with intellectual disability can access and how these experiences differ in terms of the student's inclusion into typical coursework. So first, I'll share the different kinds of higher education experiences. One way that students with intellectual disability are accessing higher ed is through a dual or concurrent enrollment transition program. This means that students between the ages of 18 and 21 who are still receiving services from their public school system under special education could receive their transition services in a college-based setting. In some states, these are called dual enrollment programs. In others, they are called concurrent enrollment programs, meaning that the student is concurrently enrolled both in high school and college. Not all states offer these programs, but it is about a 25% of the programs that are serving students in the United States are serving dually enrolled students or high school students. Another form of higher education experience is enrolling in a college program as an adult after having left special education. Often these programs are specifically designed to meet the needs of students with intellectual or developmental disability on a campus. And we'll talk more about those types of programs shortly. Finally, there are many students with intellectual disability who access college via an existing college or university option. No special program, no difference in their application or their supports. They just go down the street to their community college and sign up for a course. There are pluses and minuses to this type of approach. The plus being that the student is accessing the same services and structures that other students have access to. The minus might be that the student would not receive the type of supports that could help them be most successful. It's also very difficult for us to capture numbers of students who are accessing existing college options, as many colleges don't keep track of students that have an intellectual disability. Next slide. Now, just as there are different kinds of experiences, there are also different levels of access to college courses. In some programs, students have access to the full course catalog, meaning that they're eligible to enroll in any course that is available to other students with their same background at the college. In other programs, students may have partial or limited access to the course catalog, so they may be provided access to introductory level or undergraduate courses, but not allowed to engage in courses that have very advanced requirements or prerequisites, or in graduate level courses. In some programs, students have little or no access to existing college coursework. All of the courses that students take in these programs may be specially designed for people with intellectual disability and therefore only attended by people with intellectual disability. What we've seen at Think College is most often there is a mix of access where students have access both to specially designed and inclusive existing college courses in the university or college. Next slide. So a question we frequently get about college access for people with intellectual disability is, what do these students do? Is this just a social program? Are these students really engaged actively in the college, both as students and workers? And the answer is yes, they are. What we have found is that students with intellectual disability who are enrolled in college may audit college classes. They may also take college classes for credit and have those classes appear on their transcript. Another strong emphasis of service in these college programs is to support students with intellectual disability to participate in job tryouts, including internships or volunteer experiences. These career development experiences often are focused on early in the student's college program so that the student has the opportunity to be exposed to different or new types of vocational or career options so that they can then adjust their coursework to help them further toward their employment goals. Students are also supported to join clubs and student organizations, just as other students on campus with other disabilities or without disabilities do in college. College can be a place where the social growth is as important and relevant to students' maturity as their academic or vocational growth. So these elements of college experiences not only provide sometimes the best memories, but also can lead to the greatest amount of personal growth. Finally, the students have, in some cases, the opportunity to either live on campus or off campus, depending on the offerings of the college, their resources, and how they provide residential supports to other college students. In addition to all of these experiences, many students with intellectual disability who are enrolled in higher education are engaged in paid employment. In some cases, these jobs are on-campus jobs, either in collaboration with the college or a work-study program, or maybe off-campus jobs paid by an employer in an off-campus integrated setting. But all told, the things that students with intellectual disability do on a college campus mirror the activities that students without intellectual disability do on a college campus. And each of these activities are important in the student's growth. Next slide. So what does higher education have to do with vocational rehabilitation? And I think this is a really important question because we know that the goal of vocational rehabilitation is to improve employment outcomes for people with disability. And for people with intellectual disability, this same connection is important. Next slide. It is all about outcomes. And ideally, both the goal of the Institute of Higher Ed and any collaborating local education agency or school system in partnership with vocational rehabilitation, the goal is to help students with intellectual disability have strong employment outcomes. However, that has not historically been what has been achieved for students with intellectual disability. Next slide. What we've seen historically are consistently poor transition outcomes for people with intellectual disability. I've chosen a few statistics here from various data sources, but I think you can go to any data source that reflects the outcomes of transitioning youth with intellectual disability, and you will see similar poor findings. In this study, data from the National Core Indicators Project suggested that in 2014 that only 4% of youth supported by state intellectual and developmental disability agencies aged 18 to 21 were employed in individual integrated jobs, and only 9% of those aged 22 to 30. So the outcomes as students are leaving our systems, our education system in the K-12 arena, are very poor. Next slide. These outcomes don't seem to improve greatly as students age. In 2014-15, only 16% of working age adults supported by state IDD agencies were employed in a paid job in the community. We know that we need to do better. And frankly, the approach that we've taken for the past 20 years to support transitioning youth to have better outcomes have not been terribly successful. Next slide. But what we're seeing from some of the emerging data is a connection between higher education and employment outcomes. A recent review of the RSA 911 data demonstrated that when youth with intellectual disability received post-secondary education services as a part of their individual plan for employment from VR, these students demonstrated 51% higher wages than their counterparts who did not receive post-secondary education services. Youth that accessed post-secondary services were also 14% more likely to exit with paid integrated employment than those who did not access post-secondary services through their VR agency. Next slide. So we can tell that higher education really has the potential to have the same positive impact on employment for people with intellectual disability that it has for people without disability. We know that going to college changes people's employment rate, the quality of their employment, their rate of pay, and that these changes increase over time. We should expect that this same potential for impact is available to people with intellectual disability. Next slide. So, what do we know is happening in higher education for people with intellectual disability in the United States? I'm going to share an overview of the current existing services and then tell you a little bit more about some recent changes. Next slide. Here's a map of the United States, and in each state are the number of current programs available who are serving students with intellectual disability at an institution of higher education. As you can see, this map is dated December of 2017, and I will tell you, if you go to our national database at thinkcollege.net, that number may change daily or weekly. Sometimes programs develop and then they need to be added to the database, and in other times programs may have stopped providing services. So while these numbers change quite a bit, you can see that the preponderance of program availability is on the East Coast of the United States, with some density in larger states such as Texas and California in the South and the West, and then many fewer programs in the Midwest and Southwest and Northwest. One other thing to note, though, is at this stage we have almost at least one program in every state. The other thing to note is that there are over 7,000 2- and 4-year colleges in the United States that are options for people without intellectual disability. So while 267 programs may seem like a lot, it really only represents a small fraction of the higher education options that other people have access to in the United States. Next slide. While the number is not as high as we would like to see it, one thing to make note of is that there's been substantial growth in the number of higher education options for people with intellectual disability in the past 13 or 14 years. If you look at this trajectory, you can see that we went from 149 programs to 268. That's probably about a 75% increase in just under 10 years. So what's led to this extraordinary growth? Next slide. See, I knew you were going to ask that question. That's a lot of change in a small amount of time. What happened? Next slide. What happened was, in 2008, the Higher Education Act of 1965 was reauthorized as the Higher Education Opportunities Act. This piece of legislation had very, very strong implications for people with intellectual disability. While there are many things I could share with you, I'll just highlight 3 that were really integral to the change that occurred in the field of inclusive higher education. First, the Higher Education Opportunities Act authorized the establishment of model demonstration projects. These model demonstration projects were called Transition and Post-Secondary Programs for Students with Intellectual Disability, or TPSIDs. And these funds were authorized to enable institutions of higher education to create or expand high-quality inclusive programming for students with intellectual disability. And we will share more about what TPSIDs do shortly. The Act also authorized the creation of a national coordinating center to provide technical assistance, coordination between, and evaluation of TPSID projects, and create recommended model standards for programs through an accreditation work group. Think College at the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, has served as the National Coordinating Center since the funds were made available in 2010. So for the past 8 years, we've served as the National Coordinating Center for the federally funded model demonstration projects. Finally, the Higher Education Opportunities Act created new federal student aid eligibility for people with intellectual disability, creating a new type of Title IV program called a CTP, which I will share a little bit more with you next. Next slide. What is a CTP? So, Comprehensive Transition and Post-Secondary Program is different than a TPSID. It is a defined Title IV program that allows a college or university that meets particular criteria to then provide access to federal student aid for students with intellectual disability. So the traditional requirements to access Title IV aid in the past, before the Higher Education Opportunities Act was passed, was that students had to be working toward a degree or certificate, matriculating in the college, and they were required to have a high school diploma or GED, or have passed an ability to benefit test. These requirements were waived for students with intellectual disability if they were applying to and accepted at a higher ed program that was an approved CTP. Next slide. So here's the formula. If you have a student who is eligible for who has a demonstrated financial need and has an intellectual disability, and they've applied to a program that has been approved as a CTP, they can then access Title IV financial aid. Now, there are only 3 types of aid that they're eligible for: federal Pell Grants, federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants, and federal Work Study Funds. These students were not eligible for student or family loans. If you'd like more information about paying for college or accessing financial aid as a student with intellectual disability, please go to our website that's listed here, https thinkcollege.net, resources, innovation exchange, paying for college. Next slide. All right, so not surprisingly, these new federal programs have really great acronyms, CTPs and TPSIDs. What the heck is a TPSID? Well, let me share a little bit more with you about what a TPSID is. Next slide. Transition and post-secondary programs for students with intellectual disability, or TPSIDs, are these model demonstration projects. There is a web page on our website that describes them, provides you with background information about who's been funded and links to each of their programs. So if you'd like more information about what a TPSID is, please feel free to go to our website and click on TPSID. Next slide. So in 2010, when these first grants were authorized, the Office of Post-Secondary Education funded the first cohort of TPSID programs. Those funds were directed to 27 colleges and universities around the United States, and those grants lasted between 2010 and 2015. In 2015, the TPSID grants were recompeted, as was the National Coordinating Center. Think College applied for and was successful in attaining the grant for the National Coordinating Center. And in 2015, another 25 grantees were funded around the United States to create new TPSID programs serving students with intellectual disability. Over the course of the first 6 years of these two programs' funding, more than 2,700 students with intellectual and developmental disabilities were served in these college campuses. There were 88 campuses, both in the grantees that were funded and the affiliated sites that they worked with in 31 states. So you can see that the TPSID funding had a substantial impact on the provision of higher education services for people with intellectual disability. Next slide. Some of the key outcomes from the first cohort of TPSIDs are important to see. There were 2,245 students who attended those programs between 2010 and 2015, and they received services at 57 colleges and university campuses. Students were enrolled in over 10,000 inclusive courses. This means courses that were available in the course catalog, where the student was registered just like any other student. They may have taken these courses for audit, or they may have taken them for credit. Of these students, 846 students worked in a paid job while also attending the program. So that means while they were taking courses, they were also working. Students held a total of 1,668 different jobs. In some cases, students may have had more than one job. Of these students, 1,496, or 67%, had exited the program by the end of the 5th year of funding. And of the students who were employed at exit, 90% were in jobs that were integrated and in the competitive labor market. So you can see that the outcomes from the first TPSIDs not only demonstrated that students with intellectual disability could take courses, including courses that were in the course catalog and attended by people without disability, but that they also could simultaneously be employed and work in an integrated setting, both while they were in the program and when they left. Next slide. So because of this focus on employment, you would expect that the primary agency that's targeted toward improving employment outcomes for adults with intellectual disability would be involved. And you would be correct. Vocational Rehabilitation was involved in the TPSID program. Next slide. You will see that among the TPSIDs, 40 of the 52 campuses partnered with Vocational Rehabilitation to support their students on the college campus. There were 12 programs that did not partner with Vocational Rehabilitation over the 5 years. Next slide. The role that VR played in these partnerships varied across the campuses, but as you can see, the primary role that VR played was to provide direct service to the TPSID students. In many cases, this meant providing career development and employment services. In other cases, about 30% of the VR's agencies that partnered with higher ed participated in person-centered planning. That's what the PCP stands for. This was a type of planning that all TPSIDs were required to offer students with intellectual disability. In other cases, VR provided training to TPSID students or other instructional opportunities. And in a very small number of cases, VR provided transportation for students in the TPSID program. One thing I will say, that the higher ed programs that were launching these TPSID models found that the relationship with their VR changed over time, and often there was some get to know you phase where VR was really trying to understand what the purpose of these programs were and the right role for them to play. But as these relationships evolved, these partnerships in many cases became very strong, and they realized that they were working collaboratively toward the same mission. Next slide. The TPSIDs overall had a very positive impact on the provision of higher education in the United States for people with intellectual disability. One outcome is that the TPSID grants enhanced public awareness. Even in states that didn't get a TPSID grant, many had applied for it and not received it. But the idea that there was an $11 million investment in higher education for people with intellectual disability made more people, parents, students, school systems, as well as higher education and state agency personnel, aware that it was happening. And that made a big difference as this field began to grow. It also created very strong engagement with new institutions of higher education. A number of the TPSID grantees that were funded served as consortia and developed over time not only programs at their own campus, but at other campuses throughout their state. Finally, a significant impact of the TPSIDs was that it generated many new state policies, funding sources, and legislation. If you go to thinkcollege.net and what is happening in your state, and click on the What is Happening in Your State button, you'll be able to look at each state and see if there is a consortia available in your state focused on this issue, a task force, or if your state has created or passed legislation that would support the development or support of future inclusive higher education options. Next slide. So overall, here are all the places that TPSID grants were funded. You can see that much like the national map I showed earlier, the preponderance of grantees were on the East Coast. This is partially because this is where the preponderance of higher ed programs existed that were already serving students with intellectual disability. But we do hope that in the future there will be more attention paid to offering a more geographic representation of TPSID investment in higher education. Next slide. So the critical piece of this is not only that inclusive higher education exists, but that it actually improves students' outcomes. And that's why our hope is that vocational rehabilitation will continue to be a player at the table and an integral voice in moving this field forward. Next slide. Here are some data from the second cohort of TPSID programs that were funded in 2015. And as you can see, while 56% of the students who came in who were employed had never held a paid job prior to enrolling, there were 43% of students who were either in a paid job or in a paid job and participating in career development services. Another 43% were participating in career development services, which in many cases may align with pre-employment transition services that are currently being supported and funded under WIOA by state PR agencies. Next slide. If you look at the employment data at exit for the first cohort of TPSIDs, you can see it began rather low, and it looked very similar to the national average of employment of adults who are being served by state IDD agencies. But over time, during the first 5 years, the employment at exit grew to 40%. And now you can see the data from the first cohort, the second cohort, year one at 35%, which is much higher than year one of the first cohort. This demonstrates that the TPSID programs are building strong infrastructure around employment that leads to better employment at exit from the program. Next slide. And here's really what matters in the long run. Going to college is a really positive thing, but if it doesn't provide students with intellectual disability with positive outcomes after they leave the program, it's not as impactful. But we've found that 61% of students who completed a TPSID program had a paid job 1 year after exit. These are the kind of data we would like to see. We believe this number can continue to grow. as higher education becomes more prevalent, as their employment services become more refined and reflect 21st century customized employment practices. And we believe that vocational rehabilitation is the partner who should be assisting to ensure that these outcomes continue to improve. Next slide. So, in summary, I hope that after hearing this brief overview of inclusive higher education, you found that it's provided a new pathway for students with intellectual disability to access college as a means to better employment outcomes. I also hope that you've seen that the Higher Education Opportunities Act provided really important guidance and funding for higher education to enroll students with intellectual disability. We really believe that vocational rehabilitation is and should continue to be a primary partner in the current higher education programs serving students with intellectual disability. And as you can tell from the data, the employment outcomes for students who have attended TPSID programs are much better than the employment outcomes seen in national averages. Next slide. I've provided a few resources for you if you're interested in learning more about vocational rehabilitation and its involvement in higher education. On the RRTC website, vrpracticesandyouth.org, if you click on post-secondary, there are a number of fast facts under center publications. To learn more about the TPSID model demonstration projects in particular, you can go to this link on our website. And if you'd like to connect with other people who are talking about this, both from program perspective, the school perspective, and the VR perspective, please consider joining our Think College Affinity group on vocational rehabilitation. Next slide. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn a little bit more about inclusive higher education. If you have questions about today's seminar, or if you'd like to learn more, please visit us at thinkcollege.net. And if you're looking for help, please come to our help desk at thinkcollegeta@gmail.com. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for listening to this Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices and Youth online seminar. Please follow the provided link to take the quiz. As a reminder, if you score 70% or more above, you will be emailed a certificate of completion. If you score below 70%, you'll have one more additional opportunity to re-watch the seminar and complete the quiz. Thank you.